Well, as Nardine said, thank you all for coming. We're very excited to present to you guys what we found and some of our recommendations as well. Uh, as Nardine said, my name is Canning Malkin. I'm an independent researcher and I'm co-leading this research with Franzi Maier. The aim of the workshop is to present our findings on agenda setting practices and dynamics in transnational and global citizens assemblies, as well as, like I said, present some of our recommendations. And we're really excited to hear also about all of your thoughts at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so as Nardine said, we're GLOCAN. Our aim is to provide action-oriented analysis and insights so that we can strengthen and scale global citizen participation, and we're comprised of practitioners, advocates, academics, researchers from across the world who are dedicated to that principle as well. Next slide, please. So I'll go into why we're looking at agenda setting and specifically in transnational and global citizens assemblies. So in our research and also as we were beginning this research project, we found that there are two things at the core of deliberation: who is discussing and what is being discussed. The what is being discussed is often overlooked, despite, as I just said, being critical to deliberation. My second point, in essence, what is being discussed determines the scale of deliberation, its thoroughness and impact, and the event's ability to achieve its ultimate aim, whatever that aim may be. Agenda setting is particularly relevant to transnational and global citizens assemblies, firstly because of the growing discussion of democratizing global governance, and we believe that given its importance to deliberation, agenda setting should be investigated as a part of that democratization. Secondly, it's hard enough to collect a cohesive agenda that reflects citizens' priorities when there's just one actor involved in the deliberative event. When multiple nations or actors convene a deliberative event, it's especially difficult to achieve that. So it's therefore even more important that care is taken in the agenda setting process of transnational deliberation to ensure that topics are representative of citizens' interests and are applicable to their lived experiences. Similarly, when there are multiple actors involved, there are even more definitions of what impact an assembly could have. Given that the topics discussed directly influence an assembly's effect, the agenda should be set thoughtfully to meet those impact goals. Next slide. So it should be noted, a limited selection of large-scale assemblies for us to draw from. But we chose these four because we felt that they demonstrated a variety of commissioning contexts, agenda setting styles, scopes, subject matters, peoples, and larger policy or legislative remits or purposes. I'll now go over our four assemblies and their commissioning context, by which we mean the motivation for their commissioning and the moment in time that they arose in and what that situation looked like. So the European Citizens Consultations took place in 2006, and they were commissioned by civil society organizations, namely the Kim Baudouin Foundation and their partner organizations, regionally and across the EU. They were responding to an outsized negative media representation of the EU and wanted to give a more accurate picture of how citizens felt about the EU and what they wanted from it in the future. The Conference on the Future of Europe took place in 2021. It was commissioned by the three European institutions in what is called the, quote, joint declaration. There's a longer, more technical title, but it is regarded widely as the joint declaration. The declaration set out to allow citizens a space to effectively input their priorities and wishes for the future of the EU into the policymaking process. The Global Assembly on the Climate and Ecological Crisis also took place in 2021. It was conceived of by deliberative democracy expert Rich Wilson as a large-scale deliberative response to poor global climate governance structures and commitments. He wanted an opportunity also for citizens to give their voices to this urgent crisis, as I'm sure lots of you are aware of. I see a lot of faces who are probably familiar with the Global Assembly. And finally, the Global Citizens Assembly on Genome Editing had a very non-traditional commissioning context. When in Hong Kong for the second International Summit on Human Genome Editing, Sonia Pemberton, who's a filmmaker and documentarian by trade, realized that the scientific community needed to better engage the general population of the topic of genome editing. She thought that there needed to be a space where the global community could discuss this big ethical problem, and conceived of a deliberation event before she even knew what deliberative democracy was. Next slide. So after our literature review and interviews, we found that there are a few lenses of analysis that were useful to better understand how these cases eventually arrived at their agenda setting style. That's why agenda setting style is right there. It is not a lens, but it is it's important to keep it within that context so that we remember what it is that we're looking at. So the first is linkage to a decision-making body. By this, we mean how closely linked or docked a given assembly was to the decision-making body, usually a governmental body. We found that how closely linked an assembly was to that decision-making body impacted the design of the assembly and thus the agenda setting style. Next, we have top-down versus bottom-up. This means who initiated the assembly. Top-down refers to assemblies that were commissioned by governmental bodies. Bottom-up refers to assemblies that were started by people outside of governmental bodies, be they civil society organizations or individuals. We found that these two structures determined who decided the agenda setting style and how that decision was arrived at. And lastly, scope and questions. By this, we mean when an assembly is convened, the organizer typically has a set of questions or sets out questions to be answered in that assembly. And these questions obviously have a direct influence on the way that the agenda was set or how commissioning bodies might project those questions. Next slide. I'll briefly go over how each assembly set their agenda. For the European Citizens Consultations, they held a democratized agenda setting event in which 200 randomly selected EU citizens convened in person and discussed in small groups what were the biggest ways that the EU influenced their lives and the ways that they would like the EU to touch their lives in the future. They came up, after aggregating their deliberations, they came up with 3 broad policy topics that would inform the national citizens' assemblies that would follow. For the Conference on the Future of Europe, the agenda was set almost entirely by the European Union. There was something called the multilingual digital platform that they used that allowed citizens to input their priorities or concerns or wishes on a given set of 9 topics, not including an other box online. But these 9 topics were set by the European Union. As for the Global Assembly on the Climate and Ecological Crisis, the commissioning actors and expert members set the agenda. And the similar thing happened with the Global Assembly on Genome Editing. The commissioning actors and subject matter experts set the agenda. And I'll pass it over to Franzi.
Great, thank you. I will then move on with the 3 remaining points. So political linkage, as Canning has already pointed out, is about how closely docked an assembly was to political entities and thereby also to political decision-making. For the European Citizen Consultations, there was no official political linkage. At a later stage, the civil society actors got funding from the European Commission, also invited a commissioner to speak. But the intent was very much rather to encourage discourse between citizens, to get citizens thinking and talking, and also realizing that they have policy action capacities within the context of the EU rather than to directly influence policy. The perhaps contrasting example is the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was, as we mentioned, commissioned by the 3 EU institutions, and all 3 EU institutions in this joint declaration also promised to take up the results. It's not entirely clear, or it wasn't specified how exactly these results would be processed, but it was set out that each institutions would look at the recommendations and input them in their processes, discuss them, and also respond to them. For the Global Assembly, This was also independent from political bodies, not docked to a political entity, but docked to COP26. So there was the intent to be part of that political conversation and to be part of a political process, basically, and perhaps add voice to a process that already includes political actors, civil society actors, etc. And for the Assembly on Genome Editing, here too, there is no direct institutional link, but there is the intent to be part of a political conversation. And this was realized by setting out to address demands that were made by international organizations on the issue of genome editing. So again, the intent for the last two is perhaps more to be part of a political conversation, to make sure that citizens' voices are added to that conversation without a predetermined political path. Whereas for the Conference on the Future of Europe, there's kind of a more direct ambition to influence policy. This is linked to what we categorize as top-down versus bottom-up processes. It should be mentioned that we see top-down processes as those that were initiated by political actors or political processes directly, whereas bottom-up initiatives are those that are initiated by civil society, but we can still distinguish a little bit by whether there were multiple actors involved in bottom-up processes or whether it's perhaps driven more by individual actors. So for instance, the European Citizen Consultations, we've already mentioned the initiative came from civil society actors. However, there's very much one civil society actor at the center, the King Badwin Foundation, who also then recruited other civil society actors, got other civil society actors on board to join them in making important design decisions. But perhaps there's still, just a power dynamic in having one civil society actor take the lead and take final decisions. In the Conference on the Future of Europe, the initiative and main decision-making was with what was called the presidency, which consisted of actors, again, from all three institutions, so the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. And the hands-on decisions were taken by a common secretariat made up of administrators, again, from those three institutions. So here, all decisions were taken at the political level by those institutions. And what we saw and learned from our interviews is that there were moments where other actors could be more involved in decision-making. Largely, however, that was driven when those political actors couldn't come to a decision or couldn't agree. So particularly in the context of the EU, those three institutions at some stages had very different interests and ambitions in mind for the conference, which meant that some decisions couldn't be made and were then passed on to the deliberative experts who were in charge of designing the process. And this then opened up actually some capacities for deliberative experts, civil society experts, and also the citizens to actually take some decisions on the agenda and set their own priorities. For the Global Assembly, the initiative and main decision-making was led by a group of civil society actors. So here we see perhaps several civil society actors taking those decisions together, including taking decisions on the agenda and design process. And for the Assembly on Genome Editing, the initiative came from a filmmaker, so perhaps an unusual setup a little bit, who then asked research centers and more actors to join, in particular to bring in that expertise also on the deliberative process and design. And here, even though the initiative lies with one actor, there's kind of different areas of expertise between those actors that perhaps again influence who makes the decision on what. And these different structures are reflected in kind of what might be the main question, namely, who set the agenda, how was the scope, how were the questions for each of those assemblies defined. For the European Citizen Consultations, there was thorough thinking about how to design the entire process. This was, of course, also a relatively independent process that civil society actors could really take in their own hands and lead and design as they saw fit. So what they decided to do is to have a deliberative agenda setting event with 200 citizens that served the purpose of setting the agenda. So already the agenda was set in a deliberative mechanism. And that deliberative agenda setting event took or decided on 3 priority policy areas. These were still relatively broad priority areas. So for example, climate and environment was one, which some of our interview partners also pointed out as quite remarkable, because at that time, that perhaps wasn't an as mobilizing topic as it is now. So it's seen also as, yeah, remarkable that citizens here were able to voice what they thought were priorities. So the outcome was still relatively broad topics, but the ECC panels finally were limited to those 3 topics to have a very clear-cut and clearly defined policy area or fields that they would focus on. For the Conference on the Future of Europe, the presidency decided on 8 topic areas, which really cover the full breadth of topics relevant to European politics. So this ranged from foreign policy to social policy, climate and environment, economy, etc. There was also one topic area called Other, which some of our interview partners pointed out was meant for citizens to add other issues they found important but not to be fitting into those 8 topic areas. And even though there was, as Canning mentioned in the beginning, this multilingual platform where citizens could input their ideas, this didn't lead to a narrowing down of topics or topic areas. In the process of designing the conference, this common secretariat that took the hands-on decisions on it discussed narrowing the scope and posing more specific questions to citizens. They then decided against doing this because it was too difficult to agree, but also because some actors felt that it would be difficult to do this in a way that still keeps topics neutral. So in the end, topics remained relatively broad, and this is where space was then made for deliberative designers within the panels to actually have citizens set their agenda within their topic area. So they prioritized, for instance, in the field of foreign policy, what are the areas that we want to focus on as citizens? For the Global Assembly, as I've mentioned, this was docked to COP26, so it's a very specific setting also and a very specific policy field that was targeted to be addressed from the beginning onwards. And there was one framing question that the civil society actors decided on posing together, which is how can humanity address the climate and ecological crisis in a fair and effective way? So both remedying climate change, but also the social justice component were put on the agenda here. In the Assembly on Genome Editing, there was also some discussion on how to define the scope, because of course genome editing can reach also into environmental issues, genome editing of plants, animals, etc. And within the commissioning context, there was some discussions about how to draw this line. And here it was mainly the deliberative experts who advocated for specifying the area and actually just focusing on human genome editing as the topic that is perhaps the most controversial or the most tangible as well to participating citizens. So here too, there was some discussion about how to exactly draw the lines of the agenda. So this shows how those different commissioning contexts, and this is why we talked quite extensively about the design, influenced how the agenda was being set, how decisions on the agenda setting was made. But it also shows kind of the very difficult questions and trade-offs that are inherent to how agendas are set. And in many of the, or actually in all of these cases, actors debated on whether it is better to have broad topics or specific topics. And there are some conclusions that we draw from this. They're still very preliminary, and we're very interested in hearing what you think about them, perhaps also what your experience is on any of these. what in the end our takeaway from these 4 case studies is that agenda setting should be purposeful. It's often kind of an afterthought or something that just happens in the design process or is very much dependent on the resources available, etc. But there's many different ways to do it, and how exactly it is done depends on the purpose and influences the purpose and impact that the assembly has. So in our conversations and in the case studies, we found 3 different types of purposes that actors wanted to achieve with the Transnational Assembly. The first is policy goals. So this would be very clearly an event like the Conference on the Future of Europe, where the idea was to have clear political outcomes, political recommendations, and recommendations that can feed into the policy cycle. The second is agenda setting goals. And here it's more about hearing what citizens' priorities are, what their worries are, understanding a little bit better which topics are important to them. So the agenda setting event in the ECC is one example of that. And lastly, what some actors also mentioned is that the goal wasn't even necessarily political, but there is a participatory democratic goal behind it, where people say what we want is to show that citizens can have constructive conversations with each other. We want to convince policymakers that citizens can talk about politics together. And especially in the context of the Conference on the Future of Europe, many actors emphasized that they were surprised by the results being relatively reasonable and doable and in line with what is actually on the political agenda. So that's perhaps more a broader goal of encouraging deliberative events and showing their feasibility. One broad discussion with all of our cases was how specific should a topic actually be? And there was quite some disagreement on this. Our takeaway would be that topic specificity should depend on the purpose of the assembly. So broad topics might be particularly useful to capture citizens' priorities, to better understand what plays a role for them in their everyday lives, whereas if a citizen assembly should impact policy and have a political impact, a clear message also that can be taken forward where it's possible to say this is what citizens demand, then perhaps a specific topic is more suitable because it allows the results to fit into the policy cycle, because it's easier to communicate, but also because citizens actually get to a point where they can talk about specific policy design quicker and more concretely within limited time. One other consideration that we had, and here too we'd be curious in hearing your thoughts, is that perhaps in the process of agenda setting there's a trade-off between political impact and perfect design. So we saw this in particular when comparing our 2 European cases. In the ECC, civil society actors could really think through what would an ideal process be, where we democratize every part of the process, where we make sure there's deliberative engagement at every part of the process. This was slightly more difficult to do in the Conference on the Future of Europe, for instance, because it was docked to those political actors, and politics can just be complicated, right? It's difficult for political actors to agree. But with the greater political docking, there is, of course, the promise that the outcomes of such assemblies will actually feed into the political process, that they will arrive directly with decision makers. So perhaps that's a trade-off there between accepting that if assemblies are part or integrated into political processes, they might be imperfect from a deliberative vantage point. And lastly, and this is something we, I think, mentioned already at the beginning, commissioning context is key to purposeful agenda setting. And of course, the commissioning context also helps us find out who actually holds the power and decision-making in assemblies. And what we think is important there is that considerations on how to democratize agenda setting are on the table from the beginning onwards. It's perhaps a cool idea, but not always possible or necessary to have big agenda setting events, but it should be a consideration on how to make sure that citizens are discussing things that they actually find impactful. In line with that, what we noticed is that it's Also important to make transparent from the beginning the scope, impact, and remit of the assembly, so to really communicate what will happen to these recommendations, just because that also helps to better understand how should our recommendations be formulated, how should we respond to the agenda, etc. And what many of our interview partners emphasized is that reaching broad engagement, which especially in context of scaling up deliberation, getting more people involved in deliberative processes, but also in terms of engagement, so getting those citizens who have been recruited to stay on board for the whole process, that both of those things can be very strongly impacted by the agenda. So if the agenda is relevant to citizens, if the impact is transparent, the probability is just much higher that citizens will actually participate and engage in those processes, which is important, of course, for the legitimacy of their outcomes as well. So these are our preliminary insights based on those 4 case studies. We're very curious to hear what you think about this, but we also thought of some questions that we'd be particularly interested in, especially seeing that there's people in the audience who also have a lot of experience and perhaps also experience from other cases to add. So I'll hand over to Canning for those before we wrap up.
Yeah, as Franzi said, we would love to hear any and all thoughts. What would be a particular perhaps help if you guys wanted to answer these questions would be what generally are your thoughts or questions on what we found? What additional insights or experiences can you share on agenda setting? Be they best practices, challenges, trade-offs inherent to agenda setting? What, if you have practical experience with the process of designing and implementing, what were some unique issues unique to agenda setting? And which questions do you think merit further research into agenda setting, and what should that focus on? What aspects of agenda setting did we not cover here, or what aspects of agenda setting are particular to small assemblies versus larger assemblies, if there are any distinguishing factors? What, in your all experiences, should we look further into regarding agenda setting? And anything else you guys have to share?